Just thought, given the theme of the last 2 days, whether the panel could comment on whether you felt frustration in your time working in government with respect to large parts of entrenched bureaucracy or sections of bureaucracy that don't appear to add any value. Maybe they're mainly involved in coordination. Just in terms of the outcomes or outputs that those areas need to be able to contribute these days, and whether you've experienced that sort of frustration and what you've done to change something that is maybe not very useful into something that is very useful, given it's unlikely you will be able to get rid of it. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, if I could start. It's a fascinating one, because I've thought about this before my talk and didn't really get into it, because in my own career it's really varied by sector, and it's hard to attribute it to anything that's universal. It's usually unique to that department. So the ability in the end, for example, in the social services side, called human resource development in those days, to respond to changes in the Canada Pension Plan, even though they had a lot of reservations about it because of the way they saw their clientele, they adjusted and things have gone fine. Other areas, such as the Department of Indian Affairs, are entrenched and frustrating and every bit as much of the problem as anybody out there in the client group. And trying to see how that could be changed, I don't know how to change it, and yet at the same time, it's not one of those things you could, for lack of a better word, sell off. You're not going to sell off Indian Affairs. Who's going to be, like, that'd be nuts. So there are, and trying to figure out how to take some of these, my word, not yours, dead cultures, and figure out how to reform them is a terribly interesting question. I generally speaking think you can't. So in Canada, that's around, in many cases, the crown corporations, what we call the crowns. They do commercial activities. A railroad, for example, atomic energy. Some of them just have cultures which are not capable of change and continuing on. And I think that's where the serious work in government has to be. If you can't change it, what do you do with it? And how do you reorganize it?
So what about the Finnish case with the massive downsizing, and did it lead to demoralization? And what about the line agencies?
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, massive, yes, in a way, but it was very gradual. So, in fact, we have had different periods, different kinds of periods during the time when we have had these cuts, and you know, better and worse, if you like. We started, I think, you know, with the so-called new public management. When that ideology came, you know, there was the main way or method to downsizing was to change certain government functions into corporations, either state-owned enterprises, or we also created a new type of organization which was in between a stock-based company and pure government. We called it like a public corporation. And that was very often a kind of a intermediary step or stage when something was to be. We didn't privatize, you know, like that or outsource. Like, for instance, the railways is a good example. That first it was transferred. It was a, you know, at the end of '80s, it was still like a government agency, the whole railways. Then it was turned into public corporation, which was, there were no stocks, but it was kind of operated like a business, you know, like there was the management style was like business type, and then later on parts of it were privatized. So that was like step-by-step approach, and by that time we didn't have any. The public agencies did not sack people, but it was always like with using the, how do you call that, the natural turnover, or when people retire, then they will not be replaced. So that was the policy. Then we had a more severe phase from 2003 to, let's say, until the beginning of this government, when we had what we call the productivity program, and that was more severe. Like they were really they put like ceilings to certain areas of sectors of government, and at the worst stage it was like cheese slicing in a way that you put the same percentage for everybody, and that was a frustrating phase, I think, for everybody, because it was like too technical and too kind of it became like a budgetary process, if you like, and that was there was a lot of criticism on that. The State Audit Office made an evaluation of the whole productivity program later on and found many negative sides in it. So the present government has also a productivity and they call it a productivity and effectiveness program. But it tries. We have tried to learn about the earlier bad experiences, and now there's the human human aspect is taken, and human resource aspect is taken much more carefully into account. We don't know yet about the outcomes of that program. I don't think that the cutting of numbers will be so drastic. But I showed you the number from 88, so I would say that the maybe less part of the cuttings took place right after that, and that was the corporatization way of doing it. But there was quite a lot of cuttings during this period, 2003, 2011. And I don't know, I just must say that there are different ways of doing it. But in Finland also, even with this productivity program, we didn't have like sacking. It has always been like using this natural turnover. But still it has been quite frustrating because it's like everywhere. The risk is that you have less people, but the tasks are kept the same. And now the present productivity program tries to take into account the lessons we learned. So they tried to really to introduce the ICT. It has always been in the picture in Finland, but I think that for the first time now, there's also this element of doing things differently, not only cutting the numbers. But as said, we have had different experiences during different times.
And Paul, did you strike demoralisation in local councils, and how did you build trust around new agenda?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think one of the big parts about the question as well around the sort of frustrations of government. I mean, that's kind of a big topic as well. But because there's plenty of upsides too, but there are frustrations we come across. But one thing I pick out on that, which is relevant to the local authority experience, is around how we morphed from a more sophisticated take on performance and objectives and targets into something where I think we kind of created a bit of a monster. And I remember doing some work when I was in the Home Office looking at this before the change in government. And I forget the exact number, but I think it was something like 38, 58 different programs just from the Home Office down into local authorities and to the police that all sort of specified what must be done and often actually how it should be done. But with no sort of comprehension of what else was being asked around just within that one department back out to the local authorities. And I think we massively overdid that. And we created this reporting monster. So we had the bureaucrats in the central departments phoning people up if they hadn't met these particular targets and checking to see what was going on. And of course that replicated at the other end too. And in that is a sense of real frustration, because then it becomes about compliance, it becomes about gaming, and it removes that sense of control and autonomy, not just from managers, but from ultimately from frontline professionals. And I think that's probably true in policing as well as local authority, community safety activity too. So the changes that came about from that were essentially politically driven. Essentially just wiped all that world away from the Home Office side, which at the time felt like a really brave move, right? But actually got rid of that sense of pretend control that you had at the centre, because actually you didn't really have the control, but you had often a sort of an illusion of control, I think. So, I think when we're talking about efficiency and reform of public service reform, I think we really did make some big progress and some quite sophisticated progress in understanding what we did, how we did it, what our objectives and priorities were through the delivery unit processes and others. But we sort of begat a bit of a thing that was unexpected, and I think that my sense of how the frustrations are both created and relieved. I think there's something in how we get the right balance between clear objectives and performance targets and knowing what's going on in our organisations, and but not using that as the tool to manage and solely the sole tool to manage, because it ends up having all sorts of distortionary effects that create frustrations through the whole system, right?
I haven't been a civil servant for a long time. I've mainly been an academic, but I have been an embedded academic. I've worked quite a lot with organisations involved in change and innovation. And I'm thinking I worked, for example, for 3 years in a very large local authority that actually had to cut its staff very substantially. I think one of the things about trying to understand inertness or resistance to change is to really start by trying to get in under the skin and into the mindset of the people whom you're experiencing in that kind of way. And I think currently in the UK, with the austerity cuts that we've got, one quite valuable way to look at that is to think in terms of the psychological contract, which is the sense that employees have about what they owe the organisation and what the organisation owes them. So currently I'm doing some work with some police forces in the UK, where actually a number of police staff and police officers feel that their psychological contract has been undermined. They joined for a good pension, an exciting job, and now they're faced with much less good terms and conditions, harder work, redundancies amongst police officers for the very first time, and so on. And we did some work with one of these police forces where we really looked at what this psychological contract, basically, so what police officers expected. We talked to the senior management team, the chief constable and the senior management team, and they, for the first time, really got it, what that was about, and started working with their employees in a different way. And they reported to us very recently that that had helped. So I don't know if that's a useful way to think about it.
Okay, I think we have a question over here on my left.
Hello. Tamara Cutcliffe from the Institute of Public Administration. Thank you, all speakers. It's been a fantastic 2 days. I'm very interested in the pragmatism shown by the Finnish government, and in particular their October annual day where they celebrate failures. Just wondering how that's experienced in other countries, and whether failure is seen as something that doesn't get reported in annual reports and isn't sort of continually brought up. Just wondering, if there's anything you can bring to bear to perhaps make it a bit more acceptable within Australia to sort of fail.
Did you get that, sir? The question is, do you have a kind of safety valve for failures that may have been done in the year when you announced them as part of a kind of public transparency process, I think?
We talk about it. I think that it's not yet there, kind of. Like, I don't know if this has to do with what you're asking, but we are, at the moment, we are trying to introduce the idea of experimenting things, reforms, and any kind of changes in organizations or systems. But that's quite new, like experimenting. But that idea of let's try, and if we fail, it's okay. It's good. It can be a good experience anyway, because you learn from that. But I must tell you one curiosity. Maybe it's a curiosity for Finland, is that at a certain stage when we tried to introduce an experiment on some changes in the social security system, it was our highest legal authority who took the took the opinion that no, you can't. It's against the constitution. If you experiment with something that has to do with some goods or privileges, or how do you say, goods or rights of people, that everybody, we have this universality principle so deeply rooted in our minds that the legal authority took this kind of an opinion. But this has recently been questioned, because I mean there's a controversy that the people who want to improve management and governance, they would like to see this kind of an experimental way of going forward. But we have this this opinion of the legal authority, but I think it's under discussion at the moment, because that's a dead end, really, if you want to have the agility in the government in the sense. But I would say that it's coming, you know, it's changing. That is some of the mental change that is going on at the moment.
We've just got a new Doctor Who, and Patrick Dunleavy is a bit like Doctor Who. He comes back in different manifestations. And before he caught the productivity TARDIS, he actually wrote a very well-cited paper on explaining policy failures and what we can learn from it. So, Patrick, you must jump in.
Yeah, well, maybe I could just say one or two things. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do innovation, you need to have a portfolio of things, and some of those things are not going to work. That's for sure. And I think finding ways within the public sector that we can move away from an all failure is terrible kind of perspective to a kind of realistic portfolio approach. I think some of the answer has already been raised by Paul in a lot of what he said, which is that as you move towards more micro-level innovations and you do less of these big-scale innovations, some of the problems go away, because undoubtedly some of the things that are in Paul's portfolio will probably not work, and some of them will work but not have much effect, and some of them may have much more effect than anticipated. So I think, you know, to some extent it's a question of scale, to some extent it's a question of culture. When I did a study of government IT in Japan, and, you know, they have never had a public sector IT failure, because to admit a public sector IT failure would be to so much lose face. And the company daren't admit that it didn't work, because then they'd never get another government job again. The ministry daren't admit that it didn't work. So they always cover up every single failure that they have, and they have the usual quota of failures. And because they have these very long-lived relationships between companies and departments, if I've made a boo-boo of your project, I just throw a lot of money at the problem until we can disguise it. And then gradually you pay me back over the next 25 years for all the money I've spent remedying my mistakes or the joint mistakes. Whereas if you compare, let's say, Britain, until very recently, we had the worst government IT catastrophe record in the Western world. We've had 45 major, you know, computer problems in the last 3 decades. Perhaps we're in the middle of another one now. We don't know, but. So, you know, during the research, I was told a story by a Japanese board member. A company called Fujitsu took over a company called ICL, and then they discovered that a project that ICL was running was about to fail and was going to be cancelled by the government. And they had to fly the whole board of directors in from Japan and take 3 or 4 days assuring them that it would be quite all right, you could cancel the project, you could can it. You'd still get government contracts next year, which, you know, wouldn't have happened in Japan, and so on. So I think a lot of it's cultural and assumptional, and we need to move towards a much more realistic approach where when you're doing innovative policies, where you're trying out different things, some of what you're trying is not going to work. As long as the overall portfolio is a successful portfolio, you should get credit for that. But getting that deeply embedded into HR, getting auditor generals to take a more realistic attitude, there's obviously a long way to go in many different countries on that.
Jean, and we'll go to a question in the middle here.
I think we all know that failure can be a really rich source of learning. And so the question is, to follow up what Patrick's saying, is how do we get the organisational forms that enable that to happen? And I know from the work, the research that I've done on looking at innovation in local government, that when local authorities wanted to learn from innovators, they wanted to learn about what went wrong as well as what went right. They got deeply sceptical if they only got the case study of what went right. They wanted to know about what had gone wrong, what were the dead ends, and so on. And maybe we ought to move more to, I mean, it's slightly a thought experiment, but it would be an interesting one. The private sector company Tata, you know, that makes steel making and cars and so on, they have an award, as well as Innovation Award and Best Employee Award and so on. They have a Best Failure Award each year, in recognition that people may often try something with really good intent, but for various reasons it fails. And so they actually have an award for the best failure. Now, what would happen if we started to think about that for public services and government?
Well, I'm sorry, I wasn't going to intervene on this, but sure. One of the crossovers, I was listening to your answers, is the emergence of public pension plans as investment vehicles. And in those cultures, because they come from more of the investment world than career public servants, the notion of failure is accepted in every day and is accepted in the governance structure. And there's lots to be learned by other public servants about how failure is accepted in those organizations and not considered to be destructive. I mean, you're not irresponsible, but you certainly have huge failures, and that's part of the business. So it's just, and there are, I'm just trying to think of overlaps, and that's an interesting overlap because it's the same parliamentary owners, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes, and then further down.
Michelle Wilson, the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. I'm interested in the fact that we've talked about the expectation of public servants and the expectation of governments for us to innovate and so on. I'm interested in your thoughts of how you then manage public expectation of what governments are expected to provide, almost regardless of who does the service delivery. They remain responsible in the public's expectation.
Come on, Paul. Well, obviously one for you.
Thanks. What do I think? I think, you know, there's never been a better time for the state, whether politicians or officials, to help readjust some of that, to recalibrate some of that understanding of what government can and can't do. There's just such widespread understanding that government resources are very, very tight. That I think, you know, we've seen politicians in the UK do things differently, and that has not been as difficult as some of those decisions would have felt in the past. You know, for instance, just, I mean, part of that is a intellectual view about the role of the state and a political view about the role of the state, and different governments have different views on that stuff, clearly. But certainly, again, going back to my time in the Home Office, new government came in, and, you know, whatever the sort of the one of the, you know, immediate crisis events happened, all sort of 24-hour news sort of picked up, and you know, the civil service was ready with, okay, ministers, these are the sort of 4 or 5 things you could do if you want to announce a reaction to that. And, you know, the Home Secretary went out and said, you know, this is truly awful, terrible thing that happened. And then sort of went back in again. And, you know, that was, you know, we'd been so used to there being an announcement that then followed from that, you know, whatever money would be spent, legislation would be passed, whatever the thing was. And that was a combination, I think, of that understanding that we just didn't have the resource to be able to do that anymore. We really, you know, that was just way past the point of us having that discretionary amount of money to be able to spend on something like that, but also a different political view about the role of the state too. Now, actually, that sort of thing just sort of went pretty much unnoticed. I mean, it was just, there wasn't a public reaction to that. It was just sort of taken on board. So those sorts of decisions that were very much politically led rather than official led. You know, they were not taking credit or otherwise for that. You know, I found that was a real noticeable moment, and within the department, it was like, wow, did you see what happened then? And it readjusted our internal calibration of what was required and what you could and couldn't get away with, if you like, from in terms of the reaction to significant national events. So you know, that's one of those things that's a combination of the politics and the money coinciding with a public understanding of where the politics and the money is. So those things are possible, but let's not overplay that. You know, it's still a difficult task. It's a bit like the question on risk, actually. If I can just go quickly back to that. Has any of you guys seen? I forgot the guy's name now, but the head of Google X, which is their sort of special projects bit, and he calls himself like Captain of Moonshots or something like that, right? Like, as in, like, the mission to the moon was interesting because it was difficult, sort of thing. And he's like, I remember him talking at a Google event a little while back and saying, well, I'm not interested in the 99 projects that sort of make $10 million or so. I'm interested in the one out of 100 that makes $1 billion. And of course, it's just so different from the public sector. I mean, that is just a total different sense of risk and appetite for risk. Within the realm in which we work. So I think when we're talking about these sorts of, the political and the public appetite for shifts in mindsets in this way, we have to just be realistic about the situation we're in. And there's good reason for that. We're spending public money, and I understand that. But I think that sense of failure within the ways in which you are running your program is something I felt that we've imported with the knowledge from some of the tech guys and the agile processes, rather than that sense of let's plan it all out and then go and implement it and then find out that it's gone wrong. The ideas of the software developers of let's get something quickly out in alpha, then check it, get a version out in beta and again refine that with the public expectation before we have a final version, which again is amended and amended. It's not a failure. We're not talking about failure of the grand project. We're talking about many instances of learning and recognition that things could be better and changed as you go along, which is a different use of the term failure, and it brings in a different sort of set of expectations with the public, I think, that sort of relate back to that question, if that's not stretching it too far.
One of the answers to that question has been covered a little bit in the streams, where we've had some bodies that have moved out of the public sector sort of thing and become less kind of ministerially accountable. Australia Post, Postal Service would be a good example of that. Other times, community expectations have increased and they've become more accountable. Things like child safety, deaths in custody, things like that would be a good example. And other times, politicians have pushed in there and wanted to take either credit, floods, disasters, etc., but then they're also picking up a lot of the accountabilities once they've moved into that space as well. We've got a question here, just along.
My question is about productivity. Do you think that there's a fundamental difference between workforce productivity and organisational productivity? And if so, what's the difference in measuring them?
Guess who's going to answer that?
Our productivity expert. For sure.
Well, I mean, there is one big difference between organizational productivity and workforce productivity. And this is one that you definitely need to watch out for if you're doing outsourcing or contestability. So if an agency makes a change in the mix of what proportion of work is being done in-house and what proportion is being done outsourced, then you can often see what look like spectacular gains in labor productivity. And almost always when you investigate, you discover that there's been a shift of personnel or a shift of functions from an in-house to an out-house thing. So generally speaking, I would say that labor productivity is tending to be declining in usefulness within the public sector, and that you should be aiming for total factor productivity that looks at capital, looks at intermediate outputs from contractors. And in the UK, for example, intermediate outputs from contractors is a very large proportion of the total now. And then you look at in-house labor productivity. I think that the other thing to watch out for is sometimes within the public sector, people define labor productivity in particular kinds of ways. So, for example, you'll find often police statistics will count policemen you know, constables with a right of arrest separately from other staff, and in the military they'll sometimes count, you know, uniformed staff separately from other staff. On the whole, I don't think any kind of measures of labour productivity based on, you know, these distinctions makes a great deal of sense. When you get to services like education, people often count, you know, teacher productivity, or in the medical sector, they often count doctor and nurse productivity separately from other productivity. I would really tend to stress that it's very important to focus on the overall organization that's doing the managing. So you can have, for example, a hospital that is full of teams who are very, very good teams, who are working very productively and left to themselves would be more productive. Yet that hospital runs out of money, and they have to send people home, and they have to keep the wards empty till the cash arrives. So, you know, the team productivity appears to go down, but that's because of an organizational, managerial failure, not a failure of the team. So I'm a big fan of just focus on the organization and just focus on total factor productivity. You can certainly look at labor productivity or workforce productivity, but it's increasingly, in a more outsourced world, it tells you less than it did before, if you see what I mean.
Is there someone here? Yeah. Thank you for all of your presentations. One thing that's crept into this last round of discussion in the previous presentations has been the question of citizen engagement, which is really interesting to think about in terms of the Finnish example, the traditions that your country and others have. In Canada during the 90s, huge rounds of public consultations accompanying those big cuts. And I imagine in the UK, perhaps on the ground in neighborhoods, perhaps there are forms of engagement. So my question here is, in a time of austerity, where there's great need, just based on your comments, for sense-making, you know, for the public to buy into and kind of get a sense of proportion about all the things that you're talking about. Where does engagement fit into this? Are we actually, despite the new technologies, doing a lot less of it now? And not in the sense of just consulting to find out if a widget works better or a website feels good, but deeper engagement so that we're reframing things.
If I could start, I want to tie back into the question that came here about what do you do when you're closing down a program. I'm just racking my brains for elementary political science from the old days, but used to have steps in decision making. And one of the last steps was termination, which in those days never happened, right? And there's a little bit of awkwardness that people don't know what to deal with when something comes to an end. And how do you, it's a certain way of doing things ends. But does that mean, and I mean this quite literally in governments in Canada, does that mean you lock up all your goods and services and say, we're leaving the town? Or do you sit down with people and say, this isn't working this way, where do we go? So we have arbitrary decisions about, well, nobody needs a national park in the winter. Who goes into the park in the winter? So all parks are closed in the winter, right? You say something like, how does that arbitrariness, like how do you say that without having a conversation with people in that town? Like how do you begin to share things? And you always have executive exchanges for the top public servants to go into a private corporation, but you don't have it down for the guy who's working at some sort of front line, and maybe it's a citizens group that takes over his employment for a few years and then he goes back. I mean, I think we're too awkward about the termination end to have a conversation about how to do it and keep it going, because there's control issues, and sometimes there's union issues, and sometimes there's just nobody wants to deal with it. And you get into peripheral audiences, and if you're being cynical, you don't care about the peripheral audiences. You want the main group to be on side, whereas lots of societies are made up by peripheral things. I think of at the urban level, like while you're talking about police services, libraries get closed. Well, does a library have to be closed? Is there no middle step between closing a library and not closing a library? Can you not figure out what the middle ground is here? So I think a lot of work has to continue to be done on the participation. And it's very rare that you, I mean, you do get hostile scenes where people cannot agree. But in the main, things look after themselves if you step back and let them look after themselves. I firmly believe that. Okay.
I think we could do with being a bit more imaginative about how we think about how we engage people. I'm conscious, sometimes I talk about open innovation with public managers in the UK, and they'll say, yeah, we do that, we do consultation. But actually consultation is very different from open innovation. And I think maybe we've got into a bit of a habit, certainly in the UK, of thinking of consultation in particular kinds of ways, often around decisions that are very close to, if they haven't already been taken, they're already very close to being taken. And I think our health service in particular is perhaps a bit guilty of that. But I want to give an example of innovation that is actually very imaginative, that looks at engagement. And it's the case of Merseyside Fire and Rescue. So Merseyside is the Liverpool area. It's a very industrial, old docks, rather run down. In broad terms, there's some very vibrant parts of the city, but it's broadly quite a depressed city. And the fire service kept getting called out to arson attacks by young people. And then when they turned up with their fire engines, the young people were sort of pelting the fire engines, you know, with rocks. And it was turning out to be very difficult for the fire officers to actually put out the fires. They've got a double problem, lots of arson, and they can't get to the fires because of what's happening with the young people. So they start to engage with the young people, and they're now running some of the best youth engagement in the whole of Liverpool, because actually you've got these young lads, and they're mainly young lads, for whom physical activity, the kind of jobs that fire officers do, is immensely attractive. And so the fire service actually started bringing in some of these antisocial youth into the fire stations, got them physical training, taught them how to use ladders and what do you call them? Yeah, the water things. Forget the word. Hoses. Hoses. That's the word I'm after. And eventually, actually, have been starting to recruit from these antisocial youth into the fire service through apprenticeship schemes. I think that's a really imaginative innovation, real breaking of a mindset, and actually breaking through to a group who otherwise would be very, very disaffected.
Patrick, and then Sirpa.
Well, I just wanted to say, I do think that consultation is incredibly important, especially in times of austerity, because especially in countries like Australia and the UK with Westminster-style party systems, where there's a sort of slight winner-takes-all approach, very different from Finland, where everything is much more coalitional. Now, we have a coalitional government at the moment, and it has been less marked in its tendency to take unilateral action. But nonetheless, we are, you know, undoubtedly squeezing the poorest communities in the UK very, very severely for the next 2 or 3 years. We already have had a very serious collapse of public order in August 2011. And, you know, obviously the kind of programs that Paul is doing is trying to, you know, is doing lots of good in small ways, but the problem is that you can have very large-scale unexpected events. The August 2011 riots came out of the blue, were dismissed largely by the Prime Minister and senior officials as sheer criminality brought on by, you know, the instincts of a feral underclass. That kind of language was quite prominent in the discussion. There was no commission of inquiry to look into that, although there was an LSE inquiry report. So, you know, I'm a bit worried that in the past, when we've had Conservative governments in the UK, we've had something like an electoral riot cycle. You have a 5-year parliamentary term. About 3 years in, you have a serious collapse of public order of various kinds, and that sets back urban development and sets back a lot of social development in pretty serious ways. So I think there are a great many risks in a particularly big city and a particularly stressed community kind of contexts, in not doing consultation and not keeping a very strong ear to the ground on things like cutting back welfare benefits. And we have various kinds of policies at the moment that I think are very risky, such as we have a thing where people can be forced out of their home by a bedroom tax if they're welfare dependent. We have caps on the total amount of income that's going into poor households that in some senses could cause a lot of hardship. So I think we are in danger of running some big macro risks that if we did more consultation and we're a bit less impatient in policy making and we're a bit less draconian in cutbacks and austerity than we have been, we might well have avoided. But we'll have to see whether my misgivings are right or Paul's optimism.
If we've got someone from New Zealand here, my experience of New Zealand is they made quite a lot of cuts both to their public service numbers and to the public sector in the 80s, a lot without consultation. I remember buildings and railway stations that had brass plaques that said proudly opened by Michael Savage in 1930, and then the Kiwis would put a plaque next to it and said and proudly closed by Labour government by Mike Moore in 1987. But more recently, they've done a lot more consultation in the last 5 years post New Public Management. But if there's someone here, please join in. Sir.
Yes, I was in the Finnish realities. It is so that when we talk about public services and service delivery and public consultation, in that is in the hands of municipalities in Finland, which are very independent, and I think that there are good innovations, here and there, but it's a question of the municipalities. It's in their hands, like what they do more or less. But when we talk about government policies, this question links in my thinking. It links with the discussion that we have, and I think that in Finland and I think in many countries you have at the moment, about how to measure well-being, and it's a whole discussion about the GDP and its value in measuring well-being. And I just tell my own experience. I was attending an OECD conference on beyond GDP kind of discussion, and there was a lot of talk about whether we should ask people to what they consider as their well-being and how well they feel like being, that the people's own perceptions of well-being should be taken into account. My first reaction as a Finn was that, okay, well, why should we have that? Because we have elections every 4th year, and we have elections at many levels, European level and local level and state level. So why do we? Isn't that the kind of the way we know what people think? But with a second thought, they started thinking that when you have the elections, it is the political parties that set the agenda. It's usually it's always the same issues that are up on there. Naturally, like health, security, etc. And how about if in the future, particularly thinking of young people, that they might have completely different perceptions of what is important, and the agenda of people and their living will in future, not yet, but in future will be maybe completely different from what we have been thinking. And in that sense, I think I started thinking again, rethinking that yes, we should maybe really think about how to take into account really people's own perceptions. I don't know, and what kind of methodology we would use. What would be the at the macro level, at the level of the nation, what it would be? Because I remember in that seminar, in that conference, there was an Italian exercise where they had really they had launched a very wide and quite an expensive exercise in asking people, but the outcome was kind of like zero, plus minus zero, because the agenda, the questions were structured according to our traditional way of thinking. But how to make it kind of like an open question that, particularly for young people, I don't know how to make it, but I think that it makes sense that in the future we need something like that because the perceptions are changing so radically.
I feel like I should do a quick response. It's not my area in terms of social security by a long way. But there's different forms of consultation. As I understand it, the sort of social security moves are some of the most deeply popular things that the government's doing at the moment. In many ways, sort of are fed and driven by that sort of citizen view in the mix. So we should sort of not get. We should sort of put the other side of that. I did want to sort of talk about some of the positive bits, though. I mentioned before about the Open Government Partnership. This sort of like club of 60 countries, of which Australia has recently said that it's going to join in the mix on that, which we're really pleased about as well. And I think what's interesting doing through that process is the combination of this being a partnership between governments and civil society, and the way in which this is focused on government transparency, right, rather than sort of broader public service. But in the process of developing national action plans, the extent to which those plans are being genuinely co-created between civil society and government, I think it's one of those indications of how both the technology and sort of the mindset in parts is changing. So I think there's loads of places where we could improve in terms of how we interact with citizens in the creation of the policy process, for sure. And what sort of form does that take? Well, it means that advice going to ministers sort of comes with the papers from the civil servants, and also the civil society view alongside that. We spend a huge amount of time, working with a range of say transparency advocacy campaigners on the UK side to be able to create these plans together. And of course, we're not going to meet all the sort of demands and expectations, right? But what you're starting to get is that understanding of what is possible back into the campaigning community, and also what should be really possible back into government. It's just something that I've seen that's just, it looks and feels different from what I've seen elsewhere in government, and I just think it's an interesting development in how this is happening. And the fact that it's a worldwide movement too, so it's set up by Obama a couple of years ago, or certainly Obama-led, if you like. So it's had some of that a drive and force behind it. But seeing that operate, for instance, it's really a big movement in South America. And as I mentioned, Indonesia and some other countries like that, sort of different histories of democracy in parliaments and elsewhere. There's something just very interesting about that. So I just wanted to kind of mention that when we're talking about engagement and consultation, because I think consultation in that sort of bad old way, it becomes more amenable with new technology in a more direct way. I mean, just for instance, the engagement you get by being on Twitter in a kind of active way. I'm trying to take August off on Twitter, by the way, but still, the engagement you get in a sort of direct way, it just feels qualitatively different. I know this is small beer in the whole in the bigger scheme of things, but it feels like being a civil servant has changed in a qualitative sense through that type of electronic communication that you get with you on the open data side, if you like, my users, but also a wider section of the public too.
Okay, go down here, please. If anyone else is, we'll have 2 or 3 more, and then.
Andrew Podger from ANU. It struck me over the last 2 days that we haven't had many big debates on the platform, but between the sessions there have been very different views and haven't been confronted. I think the nearest we got was Patrick and Shelley having a bit of a discussion over outputs and outcomes. Yet it struck me that the views of Doug McTaggart and Gary were somewhat at odds with the views of some other people in other sessions. I wanted to be provocative, whether any of you wish to say, of the things you've heard in the last hour and a half, is there anything that irritates you that you think that ought to be sort of drawn out or challenged? Or is there some area of common ground? You say, notwithstanding difference of views on this, here is 2 or 3 particular things that you would want to highlight.
Jean, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think I think I would want to bring in some issues about leadership and real exploration of leadership of public services, both political leadership and managerial and professional leadership. And actually, maybe we should also throw in civic leadership as well. I mean, I'm not an economist, and I've learned a huge amount over the last couple of days about, you know, fiscal principles and productivity and all sorts of things like that. But I guess I'd like to see a bit more about the human actors who are involved in shaping some of the futures that we have in the context of austerity. So it's not quite a debate. I guess it's more what I'd like to see a bit more of around in this conference. You know, the role of leaders at middle management level, at senior executive level, the interaction between executives and politicians, the role of politicians. Because however many graphs we have, there are still human choices to be made about what we do about the data that we see. And there are choices around austerity. I think Patrick's referred to some of those. It's not an inevitability. Yeah, so that's my top of the head thought on that.
We've had many subliminal debates. We've had debates about change agents' resistance. We've had debates about outsourcing, the power of contestability. We've got some clear zealots for contestability. We've had debates about how far to go with community expectations and who pumps up community expectations. So we've had quite a lot of things there, but I think you're right, Andrew. We haven't had any podium debates. Patrick?
The thing that slightly annoys me is when, you know, people just repeat faith-based lessons, you know, and a faith-based lesson is, I'm an economist, I've been trained as an economist, this is what I was taught as an economist. I was having a debate in Sydney with Henry Erglas, who writes in The Australian, and he said, we can't measure government productivity, and I know that's true because if we could have measured government productivity, state socialism would have worked, and it didn't, therefore we can't. Now, you know, that kind of thing does drive me a little bit up the wall, you know. We can measure government productivity. We've done it, and other people have done it a little bit. We can all do it a lot better in the future. So the first thing I'd say is, you know, don't fall prisoner to faith-based ways of thinking. I mean, they can be useful, but treat them as hypotheses and then say, well, what does the evidence show? The second thing I'd say is, which I always think when I listen to any British civil servant explaining what's happening, is don't believe the hype. You know, normally people are very good at explaining how everything's coming up roses just in the next 2 years because of the latest policy initiative that's been made. So I'm a bit of a cynic. You know, if somebody says we've done this great review and it's going to really change public services or got this new ministerial impetus, I always like to think, well, let's wait and see till we see the evidence. And I think if we were just a bit more demanding of politicians and a little bit more demanding of ourselves, we could have much better run public services. I've been studying, for example, IT services in British government for the last 20 years, and all the way through, the government has been issuing information to local authorities and health authorities and public bodies of various kinds, which is heavily ideological, which is heavily imbued with talk of, you know, transformational agendas and all kinds of deeply implausible stuff. And if you then say, well, how much actual accurate information have you given to these people who are procuring IT systems and trying to cope and trying to move their thing along? How much really good quality research information have you given them? How have you been an intelligent center that helps them to make their decisions in the best possible way? The answer is very, very little. I mean, literally, the factual evidential content of most central government staff is, because of political imperatives and public relations imperatives, is really, really poor. And I would just like to see us move to a much, you know, more intelligent center, that helps people in agencies and devolved bodies to make the right decisions based on really good quality, well-researched information, and doesn't layer it on with loads and loads of hype. So those are the two things that slightly drive me up the wall.
You know, what you're just describing, Patrick, is a sense the difference between people, academics who can sit back and suck their teeth for 5 years and reflect, and people who've actually got to solve problems in very short order. So, you know, maybe one of the big gulfs here is between people who've actually got to put together solutions to problems in very short periods of time with limited capacity to act. Frankly, you know, the academic literature in too many places I find populated with people who held everything else constant and studied one variable. And that's not the world of a politician or a public servant. You've just simply got to work with what's available to make decisions in short order. And so I think there's still, and ANZSOG is meant to help resolve this, and I don't know that, I think we could do a lot more, Gary. Part of this is just the gulf between people who will spend long periods of time reflecting and quoting each other's papers on abstract theory, and if there's any group of people who get caught up in theories and ideologies, for God's sake, it's the academic community, just as much as politicians. The poor old bloody public servant in the middle is basically trying to put together solutions to immediate problems in short order. And I think that's... So I think your criticism is a very unfair one of the realities of what it's like there out on the ground. So I'm doing a lot of work with...
This is the debate.
Didn't talk much about it here, with frontline public servants, people who run things out on the front line. They live in a world... You know, when I talk about austerity, these people never have enough resource. They know they'll never have enough resource. And they're doing a remarkable job cobbling together solutions without the benefit of data and all of that sort of stuff. They've just simply got to solve a problem with very, very limited resources. That's the reality of what's going on in the middle here. So if there's a debate that ought to be had, perhaps it's that one. You know, the gulf that still exists between those who think that there's time to hypothesise and those who've actually got to try to solve problems in very short order with very limited resources.
Thanks,
Okay.
Super. Okay, yeah, come back to you.
Okay. Yeah. As a Finn and as a rational and practical person, I have it easy to agree with you and with you, but you know, no. What I wanted to say is that I think that this is the fact. We don't have enough of evidence of the reforms that we're making. That's just a fact. I told you about the Governments for the Future initiative or project that we have, and everybody knows Christopher Pollitt, a British professor who has been consulting us there or coaching us, and he was. I'm just telling you that he is involved in a European-based and wide research project, which researches research, and it's called COCOPS. I don't know if anybody has heard about that, but to me it was striking that they had gone through with I don't know how many thousands of pieces of studies and research, and the outcome is that in 7 or 8% of those studies there was some kind of evidence shown or examined. Most of it is about reform processes. You know, they're good descriptions and some analysis of how the reform processes have gone. But how about the evidence, the contribution to the let's say the economic crisis or social crisis or social problems? And I think this is just. I believe that this is true. So your irritation is you being irritated is okay, but I think that's just a message to the research community that we as practitioners we are really in the situation as you described, that we have to live. You know, we would like to know more, but we have to do, and there's a pressure by the politicians to do something, but we would really like to see more evidence. And I just think that that's a wish to the research community. Please give us more evidence.
I simply don't recognise the caricature that Gary's made about academics. Maybe I'm just feeling a bit defensive here, but I think a number of us are actually really interested in how you can use ideas, how you can use theory, how you can use questions to think about the improvement, the innovation, and so on in public services. There are some academics who are just head in the clouds and writing journal articles, but actually when you look at the academics, and I see people around the room who've been involved in ANZSOG, they have one foot in theory and ideas and are trying to use that to both provide evidence, but the other thing I think academics can do, which is really very valuable, is provide questions and provide concepts and frameworks that hopefully can be useful to people. And that's not about saying don't do anything until we've got all the evidence in. Actually, it's what Paul's been talking about, agile organizational change. If we use the very best of public managers with their deep experience of practice and academics with their interest in theory and evidence and so on, actually between us we can construct some agile experimentation, agile development, where you're monitoring and evaluating and asking questions as you go along and using that to course correct or maybe pull back from doing something, abandon it and so on. And what a fantastic way forward that would really make for us, to bring together the very best skills of academics with the very best skills of public managers. It seems to me that ANZSOG is one of those very precious contexts in which that can happen. Yeah, the debates will get a bit heated from time to time, but if we can try and draw on not making us all the same, that won't help at all, but actually drawing on our very distinctive strengths, but trying to listen to each other.
One of the things that has interested me about this conference is that in the main, we've thought about austerity mainly as a fiscal austerity problem. And one of the things we know about our future is it's typified by scarcity generally. Scarcity of public trust, and we talked about that in the UK scenario, scarcity of environmental and natural resources, and scarcity of money. And the only person who's come close to discussing that, I think, is Sirpa, who talked in her presentation about the balance of factors and some of the things that were causing a problem in Finland that needed scrutiny along with financial challenges. I'm really interested in how those things get worked into particularly long-term budget forecasting and how those things are sorted out, because the Undersecretary Treasury person who spoke earlier simply seemed to write those questions off as political choices, but I think they're fundamentally policy advisory choices, and I wonder how they're going in.
Okay. And it also raises that thing we put in the background paper about how do governments address how far their responsibilities stretch and where they should withdraw from. David, do you want to comment?
I'm not sure if I can help out too much on this one. When I did my presentation, I didn't really speak to it, but I think you can only proceed if you can align the interests with the resources. And I think this is a very slow process. I think the UK seems to be doing some work in that area. Canada's doing no work whatsoever. Canada's being very arbitrary and very selective on what they're doing. And once you break up the social consensus, it takes a long time to rebuild it. And I don't have a short answer for you, but the language isn't there right now in some countries to talk about this. And the examples from Finland were very good. It's very exhaustive as to what people are trying to do. But it's lacking in the public debate, I would say, throughout North America. And that's why you have such bitter public discussions at times. That's my,
Any last comment from?
Just to say that I spoke about the need to not only think about financial austerity, but to think about skills and energy. That's not necessarily a scarce resource, but we should be thinking about how we build on that.
And remember, many countries, including New Zealand, have statutory responsibilities to take long-term things into account. How genuinely they do that, as opposed to formally, is another matter, but they now have a statutory responsibility.
No, just a very, very quick response is that one can nothing but agree with you, and I think that well, we had very short, times for our speeches, but that's one thing that I would have very much liked to talk about. And in these governments for the future project that we have had, there's a big part of our discussion has been on trust at different dimensions, in different dimensions. But that probably we need another ANZSOG, maybe next year or so, and so to concentrate on that, because that's it's a big opening for discussion, and I don't think we can go much in depth with that now.
I do think there's something here around public service reform, not just as a sort of mechanistic, instrumental shift, but also one that does clearly impact in different areas of society and community, in the way in which actually your question to the Undersecretary sort of get that sense of, there's a democratic and societal aspect to this as we're thinking of how public services can and should be reformed. But it's right back to the point from the opening of the conference of saying, don't waste a good crisis in a way. There's nettles to be grasped. We're busy doing stuff. We're doing stuff at a rate and a pace that in public services, in all of our countries, at a rate that we've not had to deal with before. The opportunity it throws up is to grasp some of those nettles, things that have been pulled out in the conference and in the sessions today about expanding the range of providers of services, about bringing in different forms of expertise, about finding those change agents around in our organisation to be able to do things more differently. And I just think it feels like rather, the question about what we haven't sort of differed enough in some ways in the viewpoints. I just think it's just such a central point and still, very powerfully made across the couple of days of the conference. For me, that's the takeaway. It's like, actually, we're busy doing stuff. As we're getting on and making these changes that we have to because of the financial situation that we're in, let's try and make some wise choices that leave us a better place to be able to deal with the challenges that we've got in years to come. And that opportunity is in our hands. We can go and do some of those things. My only slightly regret about it is like, let's try and work out whether they work, and what the What Works centres in the UK, I think, have been really interesting, trying to pull that academic knowledge into a practical, useful way for frontline public services and for people working at the policy end like me. But we can do more of that, and that's why I really like this conference these next couple of days. But let's go and make some of those choices that we've got to get on with in the practical day-to-day public service management jobs that we have.
Good. Well, on that note, let me thank you for your questions and your attendance. Let's thank the panel for their insights and for their earlier presentations. And can I now invite the Dean to make a few concluding comments?
Well, thanks very much, John, and I'm conscious of the hour, and thank you very much, those of you who have hung in till the end. I think you probably saw a bit of pizzazz go into that last conversation that more than rewarded you for your patience. Well, a conference of this kind has a number of purposes. I guess the most important thing is to get the topic right. And I'm pretty sure we got that right, from the nature of the presentations and the discussion between presentations. I think everybody's been abuzz with, with the content of the conference and seeing that as being very important. I guess in terms of the objectives of the conference, one is that we can learn from each other, that we can learn across jurisdictional boundaries and I guess across, the divides of public-private sectors and the third sector, and I think there's been plenty of examples of that, and indeed the second dimension really is building networks across all of those and making contacts that we can benefit from into the future. So I hope the conference has served those purposes from your point of view. I think it certainly has reinforced the importance of doing what we can in the window that we now have, which I think is going to be open for quite a long time, to really focus on enhancing performance in ways that are probably more fundamental than have been thought about with the kind of salami-cutting approaches to this in the past. And I think, you know, the discussion of increasing the toolkit that Gary mentioned and so on, I think resonated with a lot of people. And we've had some good examples of different tools in the toolkit than some of us have experienced before. Well, you can't expect everybody to agree at a conference like this. I'd sort of feel we had the wrong topic if that were the case. And we've certainly seen some disagreement. Emphasis has varied. We've even seen some strong disagreement on some particular issues. But I think there was broad agreement on the importance of those issues, in particular the importance of getting good outcomes for society, and the fact that, you know, delivering under pressure, the theme of the conference, is the new normal. And some would say, I think Peter Shergold was saying that from the third sector, welcome to our world, you know. Delivering under pressure is the way it's going to be for all of us, I think, into the future. Now, Peter Shergold also said the future's here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And I think that's quite a nice insight. And I think we've had glimpses of the future from different countries' experience. And one of the things ANZSOG tries to do is not just get the practitioner academic, but also international perspectives that we can learn from. And I think that's been, my perception is that's been very, very successful. But of course, there's some elements of the future that aren't here yet. And I think the challenge is through innovation and so on to be finding ways forward, to be able to adapt and experiment. And I guess we can all feel slightly more comfortable about adapting and experimenting if we've got evidence and some good logic behind it, rather than, as Patrick was saying, you know, ideology or intuition or faith or a value-driven kind of approach. By the way, I wouldn't categorise Henry Ergas as a faith-driven person. You know, no one pays more respect to evidence than Henry in my experience. But by the same token, you know, evidence is not confined to academic journals. You know, the complete set of evidence that's relevant to public policy and to developing better ways forward is not just what we can find in academic journals. And I think that was part of what Gary was saying before. So I think there's a challenge for the academics as well as the practitioners to make sure that we're doing things and able to learn from each other and we're doing the right things. And certainly that's something that ANZSOG is well placed to try to foster. All of this is an iterative and cumulative process. I don't think there are blinding revelations and there's no revealed truth for all time. You know, it takes time, new challenges arise. What's fit for purpose today may be totally unfit for the purposes of tomorrow. There's no final destination, and I think this has to be an ongoing process. And again, ANZSOG's an institution that hopefully is here to stay to help governments advance and learn as they're going, and to share the understandings and the evidence as it becomes available. So I'd certainly like to build on this conference in a number of ways, and there are a number of ways that are already happening through research, through the dissemination of ideas in ANZSOG's teaching, particularly to the leaders of today and of tomorrow, and through publications and so on, and through more discussion forums of this kind. So this is a big conference, but ANZSOG also has small workshops and roundtables, and I guess my mind's been buzzing with all sorts of ideas for how we can have more focused discussions coming out of this larger conference. So I'll be taking stock with my colleagues about ways of taking the sort of learnings and some of the ideas from this large conference forward in the work of ANZSOG in those various ways. Well, the conference next year, which will be the 9th conference, John, the 9th conference is going to be in Canberra. It'll be in August, September. It'll be an interesting juncture, I think, at least in the federal jurisdiction in Australia. I can promise sunshine, but I can't promise the warmth that you've had here in Brisbane. So Canberra gets lots of sunshine, but, you know, that time of the year. But still, that will stimulate even more intellectual endeavour, I think. We'll be exploring themes and consulting a range of people, stakeholders, and ANZSOG board, which has stakeholders who are heads of governments at the public service from around Australia, as well as academics. And we'll be looking, I guess I'll be looking for a natural extension from this year, if we can find it. And a couple of the areas that jumped out at me really as things that were natural extensions were, one was just the interjurisdictional dimension of enhancing performance. And I know ANZSOG's looked at this in the past, but it still is quite important, not just in a federal state like Australia, but also in unitary states like New Zealand. There are many dimensions, jurisdictional dimensions to service delivery that need to be thought through and work well together. And then I guess there's the wider issue of systems to support good policy, good program experimentation. It's easy to start a program, pretty hard to terminate one. And there's a lack of, I think, understanding that with a lot of these programs, they have to be thought of right from the start when you design them as an experiment, and the data that you'll need to evaluate that experiment has to be built into the program itself. And I think that's starting to happen, but there's scope to do a lot more there. So look, there's a bit more that I could say, but I won't, knowing that we're right at the end of the second day. I'd like to thank all the presenters, particularly those who've come a long way. Sirpa's come from Finland. Recently I went on Finnair via Helsinki to Stockholm. It's a long trip. So thank you, and thank others who've come a long way here. I'd also once more like to acknowledge the conference partners, the principal partner being the Institute of Chartered Accountants Australia, but also Griffith University, KPMG, ANZSOG alumni and the IPAA. Thank you very much, all of you, for your support. I'd also finally like to acknowledge the ANZSOG Conference Committee. It's great for me coming in as the incoming Dean to have had the topic chosen and things underway in terms of presenters and so on. So it's been wonderful to see how well that all worked. So to Peter Allen, Anne Tiernan, Gary Sturgis, John Wanner, Monica Pfeffer, Janine Flynn, and Glenn Sheldon, and last and most importantly, Tracy Fisher, who, I mean, a number of you will have been dealing with her. Anyone who was standing anywhere near Tracy over the last couple of months would have heard her phone going off about every 3 minutes, and Tracy just handled that very well. Where are you, Tracy? Now, it's customary to have a really big bunch of flowers, but I've got a kind of virtual bunch of flowers in this envelope, which we'll give to you, and it says on there, "To Tracy with love from ANZSOG." So thank you very much, Tracy, for all your hard work. And Tracy, predictably, has given me an extra task, one to remind you of, and that is in the area of evaluation. I discovered when I came to ANZSOG just how insistent it is on evaluating everybody and everything, including its dean. So I didn't get such a great score in my first week, and I've been trying to do better ever since. But we'll be actively seeking your feedback also in relation to this conference. And next week, once you've had a bit of time for reflection and perhaps catch up on your sleep or whatever, we'll email you a short survey. And I thank you in advance for taking the time to complete that. It really is important to us and will also help us shape the conference for next year. So thank you very much again for attending. Thanks again to the participants. This last session I think was great. Have a safe trip home. Goodbye.